Dave Spear gave a nervous little laugh. It was part of his training as a good communist to restrain his personal feelings in the furtherance of the cause. But he had never in his life met with an ally, or a tool, or a confederate more alien to his spirit than Red Robinson. The man's vitriolic Jacobinism, reducing everything to a personal hatred of Philip, got on Dave's nerves. He had small reason himself on any account to be indulgent to Philip, but there was that in Red's tone whenever he referred to him, a feverish, murderous ferocity, which shocked and repelled his whole nature. "If you two people don't mind," said Dave, "I'd like to get a little exercise. It's lighter than it was. The sun may come out presently, but even if it doesn't, I'm sure it's not going to rain. Let's go to Chalice Hill and see how Garrett's building and diggings are getting on. I've not seen that new inscription up there, either, that everyone's talking about." Spear's two companions agreed at once to the suggestion, and they set out along Silver Street, past the Vicarage Gate, past Miss Drew's Gate, past the ancient Tith Barn, till they arrived at Chelkwell Street. They did not delay very long contemplating Mr. Garrett's improvements. As they peered between the rudimentary columns of the Saxon arch at the disturbed waters of the well, Red Robinson announced that in his opinion the laborers down there had been bithing in their fountain. Dave protested strongly against any such idea. "It's not the weather for bathing," he said. "Besides," he added, "they're all Glastonbury men, and every one here respects this place." "I'd buy there if I had the mind," muttered Red. When they reached the top of Chalice Hill, they hunted about for the newly discovered inscription, but without success. "It's either a fike or a bloody superstition," said Red. "If it had my way, I'd clear out the whole bill and heap of these bloomin' relics." "Let's sit down," said Dave, "and then we can tell Mr. Trent what we've thought of." They all three sat down on the already brown and fast withering brackens and leaned the backs against a hillock of green moss. Red Robinson became silent now, leaving it to Mr. Spear to explain to Paul Trent what their idea was. Although he would never have confessed it, and indeed would have been handicapped by his manner of speech in the expression of it, Red felt at that moment, as the sun began to show signs of breaking through the clouds, a vague feeling of sensuous well-being very unusual to him. The personality of Sally Jones presented itself vividly to his mind. He had been seeing a lot of Sally lately, and had come to the conclusion that he would ask her to marry him. He knew it was his mother's notion that he was Sally's social superior, she being the Garrett's maid of all work, and he being foreman of a factory, but he had grown to be so fond of the girl that he was inclined to risk his mother's social disappointment. It had been a good deal of a strain upon him, his former aspiration for the hand of Miss Crummy, and it had been worse than a strain the rebuff he had suffered from Blackie Morgan. With Sally, he felt, for the first time in his relations with any woman, completely at ease. Thus he sat between these two gentlemen, conscious enough that they neither of them liked him, conscious enough that he had offended them by his word about bithing in Chalice Well. The effect of that faint flicker of sunshine upon the hillside was to throw around the sturdy figure of Sally's a consolatory and comfortable warmth, like and yet unlike what he used to feel for his mother when he was laughed at his Eastern London board school. "It's nice in the hills," said Paul Trent. "Yes," agreed Dave. "And look at the way that shaft of sun, like a Rubens landscape, isn't it? Falls on Torres Field. It's peculiar to this place, a day like this, with the sun breaking through the spots, and those golden patches on the side of the Tor, and those workmen's figures in the haze. How do you feel about Glastonbury, Mr. Robinson? Have you come to get fond of it? I ain't one of these heart and feelings, said Red bluntly. But so paradoxical is a human psychology that the moment after he had made that remark, he felt an overpowering longing to have Sally Jones by his side up here, giggling when he tickled her, and crying out, "Oh, Mr. Robinson, how cynical you be," when he denounced all this fake and humbug. He didn't think of Rubens, and he didn't know purple from gold and the diffusion of all these drifting vapors. But by giving himself up to this melting tenderness towards Sally Jones, as associated with what he was now looking at, there took place within him a certain blending of the man's flesh and blood with the chemistry of the elements, such as made that misty October scene really more memorable to him than to either of his companions. "It's strange to think," said Dave, "that the mayor has his grand opening ceremony for this new shrine, this whole hillside may be covered with a surging crowd of people from all over Europe." "Yes," said Paul Trent, "but you won't get a crowd like that unless there's a miracle. And the time of miracles is past. What I'd like to see in Glastonbury is something very different from any of this miracle mongering. I'd like to see... But you had something to ask me, hadn't you? We'd better come to business now and talk later." Sorry. Paul Trent sat upright upon his rather womanish haunches, with his arms curved tightly around his knees in their soft brown covering, and his delicate hands clasped together. His figure blent harmoniously with the bracken on which he sat, and the misty sunshine seemed to caress his silky brown head, as if it were thankful to find some object more amenable to its wooing than the stubbly cranium of Dave or the carroty poll of the Cockney. He looked sitting there like a figure brought to that spot by the far journeying sun itself, so that it should be sure of it at least one wholehearted devotee in that land of graying shadows. "Well, gentlemen, what did you want to see me for?" repeated this visitor from Scilly Isles. S-C-I-L-L-Y. Not silly. Silly? I don't know how to pronounce it. Dave looked at Red. Red looked at Dave. They both were conscious of that curious nervousness which so often descends on people who have an important communication to make. It is at such times as this as if the piece of news itself stands with its bearers at the closed door of the unwitting recipient's mind and appears suddenly to these very attendants like a bride they have chosen by lamplight, and they feel a little abashed by in the light of full day. That's a good little phrase. But Dave plunged in boldly and explained how his Bristol organization, which was the largest in Wessex, had come to the conclusion that with a little skillful local handling, a real commune might be established in Glastonbury. Dave confessed that the original idea of this commune had not come from this organization, but from his wife, Persephone. "She's probably forgotten now what she said," he explained, "but she has these inspirations sometimes. And when I enlarged on her idea to the leaders of the party in Bristol, they were at once struck by it. You see, Mr. Trent, we all feel that Glastonbury may never again have the luck to have a mayor like Mr. Geard, and that we ought to exploit such a great chance." The eyes of this moth-like figure grew suddenly lambent with excitement. "Did I hear you correctly?" he cried. "Did I hear you say that your friends thought of starting a commune here?" "They didn't think of it, nor did I think of it. It was my..." But Paul Trent had leapt up from the ground and with his arms behind him was surveying the autumnal contest that was going on between the fitful sunbursts and the swallowing clouds. He seemed to be staring at the scene in order to associate it forever with the ideas of a Glastonbury commune. "Goodness gracious," he cried, "what a place this is for mists! A commune! Yes, I would be damned well like to see a commune. It was quaint to hear the mild feminine expletive of goodness gracious, followed by a so revolutionary an inspiration. Mr. Trent, cried Dave, his cheeks red with nervousness and his blue eyes blinking. You're not by any chance a communist, are you? The voluptuous mouth, with its heavy underlip, broke into an amused smile. He shook his head vigorously and, as he did so, resumed his seat at the bracken. No, Mr. Spear, he cried, laughing lightly. I'm an anarchist. My commune is just the opposite of yours. It's a voluntary association altogether. But part of its natural habit would be to pool its resources for the common benefit. Voluntarily, of course. Not by compulsion. But it would pool them, Mr. Spear. The flush upon Dave's cheeks died away, and the gleam faded from his blue eyes. He gave vent to the familiar little sigh which everyone who knew him was used to, the sigh of an honest man forced by the logic of action in a world of expediency to act against his nature. Well, he said, repeating the sigh, we can work together over this, anyway. In the Paris Commune there was communists and anarchists, so why not in Glastonbury there be one? I won't be arf glad to see a guillotine set up in this here bloody hole, threw in Red Robinson pensively. You're confusing your dates, my good man, chuckled the Phoenician-looking stranger. What price dates if I have the bloody head of P. Crow, Esquire? You're vindictive, Mr. Robinson, said Paul Trent, turning his warm brown eyes upon the savage Jacobin. If you'd had the insults I've had, you'd be the sign, mister, rejoined this cockney tuctually. I take the liberty to doubt it, sir, laughed the other. Goodness gracious, what's the point of getting spiteful? Besides, personally, I don't like the knife and I don't like to see blood. He gave a little shudder, then made a grimace. You prefer bombs, I suppose, said Red sulkily. If I hain't smart with me dites, and if I be spiteful, as you call it, I'd never lower myself by throwing them dirty things. Have you never heard of a philosophical anarchist, Mr. Robinson? Or of Kropotkin, or Tolstoy, or Thoreau, or Walt Whitman? I'm a working man, ahem, said Red bitterly. They don't teach us them high-class continental writers in the old Kent Road. Come, you two, cried Dave Spear. This is far too important a meeting to be wasted in discussion. We've got to establish our Glastonbury Commune before we begin quarreling how to govern it. Shall I tell Mr. Paul Trent all we've thought of, Red? Excuse me. As you please, mister, but I won't have none of this dirty foreign bomb-throwing where I be. If the buger art is what I says, but don't go blowing up a lot of gals and kiddies. It the buger is what I says. Hit the buger. What is buger? Bugger, maybe? And once more, under what he felt to be the contemptuous hostility of both these men, Red recoiled with a delicious slide of his imagination into the soft, admiring arms of Sally Jones. He, too, looked at the sun-smitten vapors of Gwimped-up Nud Hill, and allowed his body, the body of an unwearied, neatly dressed foreman, to mix with the elements, registering a vow that the very next afternoon he had a chance he would coax Sally to come up here with him. Well, Mr. Trent, said Dave, it's like this. It appears that the whole of the land in which Glastonbury's built belongs to Lord P. And it appears that on the 1st of January, all the leases of it come to an end. For the last 20 years, as far as I can make out, old Mr. Beer has collected these rents and renewed these leases. But this year, Persephone tells me, the old man is getting very shaky and peculiar. Angela tells Persephone that he thinks it's nothing nowadays but his meals. Lord P, of course, has no idea of what's happening, but the truth in his agent is in his dotage. While Dave was speaking, Paul Whole nature was leaping for joy. He was one of those people whose souls do not extend, as some souls do, outside the limits of the body. The soul of this man from the Scilly Islands penetrated his resilient, sensitive flesh and blood as the eddying water in a rock pool might penetrate a sea sponge. I'm going to end it there. I'm starting to the blah, 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 you know. It's good to stop before that goes on any longer. Anyway, that's Glastonbury for tonight. I'll see you next time. Cheers.